The iron door creaked open, a slow, agonizing sound that seemed to echo through the empty halls. A lone figure, clad in the black garb of the Inquisition, stepped into the dim light of the chamber. His boots, heavy and deliberate, fell with a sharp sound against the stone floor. The room was cold, the air thick with the oppressive weight of unspoken terror. At the centre of the chamber stood a woman, her once elegant gown now tattered, her skin bruised and blooded. She did not move. She did not speak. The Inquisitor studied her, his eyes cold, calculating, as he removed his gloves with a practiced slowness. He approached her with the quiet assurance of one who had carried out such deeds countless times before. The woman's eyes, swollen from days of suffering, flickered toward him, but there was no defiance in her gaze, no plea for mercy. She had long since learned that begging was pointless. The Inquisitor's hand reached out, lifting her chin with an icy gentleness. His fingers, though soft, were like iron, unyielding. The woman's breath caught in her throat, her mind racing with memories of those who had been here before her, those who had failed to survive the trials of the Inquisition. The Inquisitor spoke, his voice low, almost hypnotic, as he circled her, his gaze never leaving her face. "Do you know why you are here?" Her voice was hoarse, barely a whisper, yet the question carried the weight of centuries of fear. "Because I am guilty?" she asked, her words barely audible in the cold chamber. He smiled, the cruel twist of his lips a sign of amusement. "Guilty," he repeated, his tone laced with mockery. "Guilty of what?" "Of living in a world where those who dare to question fate must suffer for their curiosity." The woman remained silent. She had learned the futility of words. The Inquisitor paused, standing directly behind her now, his breath cold against the back of her neck. She could feel the weight of his presence pressing in on her, the suffocating knowledge that escape was impossible. The chamber was still. Only the faint rustling of his robes and the steady rhythm of her breathing filled the space. The Inquisitor drew a blade from within his cloak, its steel gleaming in the half-light. It was sharp, its edge reflecting the light of the torch in a cruel mockery of beauty. His fingers gently caressed the hilt, as if savouring the moment before the inevitable. "You will confess," he said softly. "Confess your sins and perhaps your suffering will be swift." But the woman knew better. She had heard the stories. The confessions were never enough. The acts that followed were designed not to elicit truth but to break the spirit, to reshape the soul into something unrecognizable. A low sob escaped her throat, but she held back the scream. She would not give him that satisfaction. The halls of the imperial palace were quiet, save for the soft hum of incense burning in the chambers of the high-ranking priests and the rustling of fine silks as courtiers moved in and out of the royal quarters. The air was thick with the scent of jasmine and sandalwood, a heady mix that hung like a fog over the empire. The walls, adorned with intricate tapestries and gold-leafed frescoes, told stories of a kingdom at its height, peaceful, prosperous, and revered across the known world. At the heart of it all stood the emperor, a figure of unyielding power, his rule unchallenged for decades. His presence alone commanded silence, and his eyes, sharp and unforgiving, held the weight of an empire. In the evenings, as the moonlight poured through the grand windows, the emperor would sit in his private chambers, his court surrounding him in the calm of evening discussions. The murmur of advisors filled the space, a constant hum of loyalty and deference to his will. The women of the palace, wives, daughters, and courtesans, moved through these halls with grace and purpose. Their roles were well defined, each one expected to embody the virtues of beauty, fertility, and obedience. Yet beneath this facade of harmony, secrets festered in the shadows. There were whispers in the dark corridors, hushed conversations between the servants in the kitchens, and eyes that glanced nervously at the palace walls, afraid of what they might reveal. But such things were rarely spoken aloud. To question the emperor, to challenge the structures of power, was to risk everything. And so, for the most part, the women of the court played their part. They performed their duties with grace, for their very survival depended on their ability to maintain the delicate balance of the royal world. In the royal gardens, the women gathered for their daily rituals. The scent of freshly bloomed roses filled the air, and the sound of birdsong echoed softly as the courtiers mingled. Here, the women would engage in polite conversation, their laughter like a soft breeze, their words carefully measured. It was a world of perfection, a world built on a foundation of appearances, where every gesture, every glance was scrutinized by unseen eyes. And yet, for all its beauty, this world was fragile as the finest porcelain. But the emperor, for all his power, was a man of many secrets. His ministers, trusted advisors who had risen to their stations through loyalty and cunning, served him without question, ensuring that his will was carried out throughout the empire. And yet, even within this seemingly perfect kingdom, cracks had begun to form. The whispers had become louder, the tensions more palpable. It was within these walls, under the shadow of the emperor's reign, that the Inquisition was born, a group tasked with rooting out those who dared to challenge the established order. It began as a noble cause, to preserve the purity of the empire and protect the emperor from those who would see him fall. But as time wore on, the line between justice and cruelty began to blur. For the women of the palace, the rise of the Inquisition was a quiet terror that hung over their every action. They had learned the delicate art of survival, of keeping their heads low and their tongues still. Yet the Inquisition did not care for silence. Its agents, cold and merciless, knew that to truly break a person, to render them into something unrecognizable, they need only to strip away the protections they held most dear: their privacy, their dignity, their very sense of self. And so, while the court continued to function in its world of beauty and delicacy, a darker truth began to unfurl. The women who had once moved with grace through the halls of power now found themselves at the mercy of an unforgiving force. They would soon learn that the emperor's gaze, once a symbol of power, could turn to a weapon far more dangerous than any sword. The balance of power had begun to shift, and for those in the shadows, it was a shift that would bring unimaginable suffering. It was within the most secluded chambers of the palace that the true nature of the Inquisition began to emerge. Whispers of its power had floated through the air for months, like the faintest scent of rot, but no one dared speak of it aloud. Its agents, cloaked in the same shadows they commanded, moved among the palace courtiers like spectres, their eyes always watching, their ears always listening. The noble women of the court, once assured in their grace and beauty, now found themselves under the cold gaze of the emperor's most trusted enforcers. The first to fall was the emperor's own daughter, Princess Landre. Once, she had been the pride of the court, the epitome of royal elegance and virtue. Her beauty was legendary, her laughter a melody that filled the grand halls. But beneath the layers of gold and silk, beneath the delicate exterior, there had always been a quiet fire, an insatiable curiosity that threatened the very foundations of the kingdom. She had always asked questions that, though veiled in politeness, had begun to cut too deep. "Why does the emperor never speak of the outer realms?" she once asked her tutor. "What of the lands beyond the borders of our empire? Are they not a part of the world as well?" Her tutor, an old man who had long since learned to keep his own questions buried deep, had responded with nothing more than a wary smile. "Some questions, my lady, are best left unasked." But Landre did not heed such warnings. Her curiosity, fed by the insatiable hunger for knowledge that so often accompanied power, pushed her further. She began to ask about the emperor's secret dealings, about the true role of the Inquisition, and the methods it used to root out dissidents. She would visit the palace library late at night, her eyes scanning the forbidden texts that spoke of things ancient and dark, things that, if discovered, would shatter the carefully constructed illusion of the empire's greatness. It was during one such midnight reading that she made the discovery that would doom her. Buried within the dusty pages of a long-forgotten manuscript, she found a reference to the true nature of the Inquisition's work, a terrifying revelation about its agents, their methods, and the twisted rituals they performed in the name of loyalty to the emperor. The words were written in a code so complex that it took Landre days to decipher, but when she finally understood them, she felt a chill that sunk deep into her bones. It was not the Inquisition's duty to preserve the purity of the empire. It was its purpose to break those who stood against it, to bend them to its will, to remove any threat to the throne, no matter the cost. The women who had dared to challenge the emperor's will, the ones who had caught the attention of the Inquisitors, did not merely disappear. They were subjected to horrors far worse than death, their bodies and souls torn apart in ways that defied all understanding. Lysandra's discovery, however, did not remain a secret for long. The Inquisition, ever vigilant, had already taken notice of her questions. Her fate was sealed the moment she set foot in the palace library that night. Her questioning was not the act of an innocent princess seeking knowledge. It was a betrayal, a sin too great to be forgiven. The Inquisitors came in the dead of night, as silent as the shadows they commanded. They were swift, ruthless, and efficient. No one saw them enter, and no one saw them leave. But when the dawn came, Princess Lysandra was gone, her chambers empty, the only sign of her presence the faint, unmistakable smell of burning incense that lingered in the air. The palace was abuzz with rumours, but none of the courtiers dared speak of her disappearance. To do so would be to risk their own lives. The Inquisition had shown them what could happen to those who dared cross the line. It had made an example of Lysandra. But the whispers did not cease. The women of the court, once proud and untouchable, now looked over their shoulders with every step. The Inquisitors had taken one of their own, and it was only a matter of time before they came for someone else. In the weeks that followed, the women of the palace began to change. The smile of a courtier became a mask, the laughter of a noblewoman a hollow sound. They all feared the same thing, the quiet knock on the door in the middle of the night, the soft hiss of a breath too cold for the warmth of the season. The Inquisitors had planted the seed of terror, and it spread like a disease. None was safe. Not even the Emperor's closest allies were immune to the Inquisition's reach. Rumours began to circulate of agents who had been seen in the royal chambers, watching the Emperor's every move. And it was in the darkened halls of the palace, under the flickering torchlight, that one of the most sacred secrets of the Empire would be revealed. The terrifying truth of what had been done to the women who dared to question the Emperor's will.
It was a secret so horrifying, so vile, that its revelation would forever alter the course of history.
The morning after Lysandra's disappearance, the palace was shrouded in a silence so heavy that even the light seemed to avoid it. The grand halls, once vibrant with the noise of courtiers, were eerily still, the air thick with unease. The women who had once glided through these chambers with graceful steps now moved with caution, their eyes constantly darting to the shadows, their voices low. They knew that the Inquisition's reach was limitless. No one was untouchable. As the weeks passed, the rumours about Lysandra grew darker, feeding the already palpable dread that gripped the heart of the palace. It was said that she had been brought before the Emperor, her crimes too grievous to ignore. But the truth was far worse than any whispered speculation. The Inquisitors had taken her not to face a simple trial, but to be broken, to be made an example. Her fate, it seemed, was not just to disappear, it was to be subjected to the full wrath of the Inquisition's cruelty. The women of the court had heard the stories, and now they knew them to be true. The methods employed by the Inquisitors were not mere interrogations, they were rituals of terror, designed to strip away the very soul of a person. The women who had questioned the Emperor, who had dared to seek answers to the questions he had never wanted asked, found themselves the targets of these dark ceremonies. Lysandra, they said, had been bound to a stone altar, the cold of the surface seeping into her flesh. The Inquisitors had set the stage, an ancient ritual of purging and cleansing, a grotesque mockery of the ideals of justice. They did not seek to punish Lysandra for a crime. No, that would have been too simple. They sought to erase her, to make her a warning. Her body had been subjected to unspeakable acts, each one designed to break her spirit, to turn her into a hollow shell that no longer resembled the proud princess who once danced through the palace halls. The air in the chamber had been thick with incense, heavy with the scent of burning herbs that were said to purify. But those who had witnessed the ritual, those few who had dared to speak of it in hushed tones, said that the incense only served to mask the deeper, more suffocating smells. The sweat, the blood, and the burning flesh. The Emperor had not been present, but his command was clear. He had given the Inquisitors carte blanche, anything to protect the throne, to keep the empire's foundations from cracking. His advisors, his ministers, had known of his will, but even they were horrified by what was done in his name. For Lysandra, the final moments of her existence had not been marked by her courage, but by her desperation. She had begged, not for mercy, but for an end. She had pleaded for the torment to stop, for her body to be freed from the chains that held her, but the Inquisitors had remained unmoved. Her voice had cracked, becoming a hollow whisper, a desperate plea to a power that would never answer. As the weeks stretched on, more women began to disappear. One by one, they were taken in the dead of night. Wives, daughters, courtesans. None were safe. Some were never seen again, their names lost to the dark void of history. Others returned, but they were shells of the women they had once been. Their eyes were empty, their souls shattered by the horrors they had been forced to endure. They were not the women who had walked the halls of the palace with grace and confidence. They were broken, their bodies and minds irreparably scarred. The Inquisition's power had grown unchecked, its influence reaching into every corner of the palace. No one dared challenge it. The Emperor's name, once a symbol of strength and unchallenged authority, was now associated with fear, with the silent terror that lingered in the shadows. Even the courtiers, those who had once schemed and maneuvered for favour, now cowered in the face of the Inquisition's power. The very air of the palace had changed. It was no longer filled with the fragrance of flowers or the sound of laughter. Now it was a place where silence reigned, where every shadow could hide an enemy, and where no woman was ever truly safe. The repercussions of the Inquisition's rise were felt across the empire. The once proud kingdom, built on the ideals of strength and loyalty, now trembled under the weight of its own cruelty. The people whispered of the changes that had come over the royal family, of how the very nature of justice had been twisted and perverted. The women, once the jewels of the kingdom, had become its most vulnerable targets. And the men, those who had once served in the emperor's name, found themselves unable to protect them. For the women who had once graced the palace, the world had become a nightmare. Their lives, once filled with the beauty and elegance of royal life, had been reduced to a constant state of fear. They could no longer move freely, no longer trust their surroundings. Every glance, every touch, was filled with suspicion. Every knock at the door was a potential death sentence. The women of the court, those who had once danced in the light of the emperor's favour, now hid in the shadows, waiting for the inevitable. The empire was crumbling, its foundation eroded by the very force that had once been its protector. The Inquisition had not just changed the lives of the women it had touched, it had reshaped the empire itself, turning it into a place where loyalty could no longer be trusted, and where the darkest acts were carried out in the name of righteousness. The empire that had once stood proud and untouchable now lay in ruins, its regal halls and majestic gardens filled only with echoes of the past. The women of the palace had vanished, one by one, their names lost to time like the dust of forgotten pages. Power and wealth had become a place of decay. Its once gilded walls, now marred by the marks of time and cruelty, bore the weight of unspeakable horrors, and amidst it all, the emperor sat on his throne, as distant and cold as the mountains that loomed beyond his kingdom. But even the emperor, a man once revered for his strength and wisdom, was no longer untouched by the consequences of his actions. The weight of the Inquisition's brutality hung over him like a curse, a shadow that could not be lifted. His advisors, once loyal, had begun to distance themselves, their eyes no longer filled with admiration but with suspicion. The once glorious empire had fractured, its foundation crumbling beneath the weight of betrayal and sin. The emperor, it seemed, had become a prisoner of his own making. No one spoke of the missing women, not aloud. Their disappearances, their suffering, were now woven into the very fabric of the palace's dark history, a history that no one dared to unravel. The Inquisition, still entrenched in the shadows, had continued its work, unseen but ever present. The women who had been taken, Those who had returned broken, those who had never come back, were now nothing more than ghosts, their fates sealed in the cold stone of the palace. The truth of their suffering was buried beneath layers of power and fear, a truth that no one dared confront. But as the years passed, the question lingered in the minds of those few who still remembered. What had truly happened to them? What horrors had they endured in the name of the Emperor's will? The question hung in the air like a poison, slowly spreading its tendrils into every corner of the Empire. The Inquisition's methods, once a whispered rumour, had become a grim reality. And yet, no one knew the full extent of its reach, nor the depth to which it would go to protect its secrets. Some said the women had been tortured beyond recognition, their bodies left in ruins, their souls lost to madness. Others believed that the Inquisitors had used their victims in dark rituals, binding them to forces beyond comprehension. But no one knew for certain, and the truth remained elusive, buried beneath the layers of silence and fear. The Emperor's once proud kingdom now stood on the brink of collapse, its walls crumbling, its people broken. But the one question that lingered in the minds of those who still dared to remember, the question that could never be answered, was this: had the Emperor known? Had he known what the Inquisitors were doing in his name? Had he willingly sacrificed the lives of the women who had once adored him? Or had he been a pawn in a game far greater than he could ever have imagined? The answer, it seemed, would never come. The truth had been obscured by the fog of history, lost to the cruelty of power and the silence of those who had survived. And so, the Empire continued to decay, its once great halls now haunted by the ghosts of its past. The Inquisition remained, a shadow that stretched across the land, its grip tightening with each passing year. The women, their voices silenced forever, became nothing more than whispers on the wind, a haunting memory of a time when the Empire had been something more than a kingdom of fear and suffering. And so, the question remains, unanswered, hanging in the air like a spectre. For those who remember, it is a question that will never be forgotten.